Lenin became a counter-revolutionary. While many people admire, especially the Marxists or Lenin's revolution, in reality he became counter-revolutionary and killed socialism for good, reviving the Tsarist bureaucracy that he sworn to destroy, recruiting former Tsarist loyalists into his ranks, and many of the other countries who used his example to start a revolution, like China, Vietnam, Cuba, Laos, North Korea, and any other country that attempt to use Marxism as a tool, have revived the state elite aristocracy and revive all the previous strata of previous society and basically change nothing. And when they did change, it was only the bare minimum that gives the illusion that they're achieving socialism. But in reality, they were keeping capitalism, just changing the names and changing what it is and what it's not. When in reality, they betrayed the revolution itself. And the best example you can analyze of Lenin starting this counter-revolutionary betrayal, and we can later see today's China, Vietnam, North Korea, the Cuba, Laos, and other countries in the past who trying to attempt Marxism as their alternative failed and became authoritarian. We can have to look back at Lenin's and his betrayal, starting by an excellent essay called State and Revolution, Theory and Practice by Ian McCain, which analyzed Lenin's most important work, his last known work before the Russian Revolution he joined, called State and Revolution, was considered his most libertarian work. But any other literature that he wrote after this, he did the complete opposite. There were three revolutions in 1917. The February Revolution, which started spontaneously with strikes on the International Women's Day. The October Revolution, when the majority of the Second All-Russian Congress of Soviet voted to elect a Bolshevik government, and what the Russian anarchist Volin termed the Unknown Revolution, in between when the workers and peasants started to push the revolution from a mere political change into social transformation. This unknown revolution saw the recreation of the Soviets first seen during the Revolution 1905 based on delegates elected from work-based subjects to recall workers created unions and factory committees and peasants seized land back from the landlords while unprecedented political freedom were taken granted after the tyranny of Tsarism. Hope for a better future spread around the globe and the October Revolution was welcomed by many of the revolutionary left, anarchists included, at the culmination of this process. Yet by 1921, anarchy had broken with the regime after the crushing of the Kronstadt Rebellion for Soviet freedom. The Bolshevik state was rightly denounced politically as being a party dictatorship and economically as state capitalist. How did this happen? It would be impossible to cover all aspects of Leninist ideology and practice as well as the anarchist alternative, so here I will indicate the main factors at work in the process. Lenin's State and Revolution. It is taken as a focus for written during 1917, he expressed the aspiration of Bolshevism in its best light, as shown by the fact that even today's Leninists recommend read it in order to see why we should join their party. We will compare the rhetoric of Lenin's work to the reality of the regime that was created, the theory to practice. By doing that, we can see why revolution degenerate and better understood, to use Alexander Bergsman's expression, the Bolshevik myth, in order to learn from the history rather than to repeat it. Theory. When Lenin returned to Russia in April 1917, he quickly came into conflict with his colleagues by taking a radical position. Instead of arguing in line with Marxist orthodoxy that Russia faced a bourgeois revolution and so required to create a republic and capitalism, he argued that the revolution be intensified and pushed towards social transformation by means of the creation of the new state based on the Soviets. This and continued opposition to the imperialist war saw the Bolshevik gain more and more influence, going from a small sect to a mass party in the space of a few months. He wrote State and Revolution during this heating period, aiming to theoretically justify this change in perspective. It was primarily directed at those within the Marxist movement who disagree with Lenin as well as, to a lesser degree, anarchists. The two were related because Lenin's opposition on the need for social transformation and opposition to both sides in capitalist conflict had previously only been advocated by anarchists. The bourgeoisie and the opportunists within the labor movement concur in this doctrine of Marxism. They omit, obscure, or distort the revolutionary side of this theory, its revolutionary soul, and so our prime task is to re-establish what Marx really thought in the subject of the state. Lenin does, as he promised, provide a number of long quotations from the works of Marx and Engels themselves, yet has to provide commentary in order to ensure that the reader interprets them correctly, despite Marx becoming accidental, almost anarcho-syndicalist in his writings like the Civil War in France and the Critique of the Gothic Program, and his later work, which Engels finished, called the origin of the state and family, etc., which has more anarchist, pro-anarchist statement, but regardless. This is because Marx and Engels argue differently than Lenin suggests. Similarly, this comment on anarchism, as well as distorting it, failed to address the real issue between it and Marxism. Lenin argued that only he is a Marxist who has stand the recognition of the class struggle to the recognition of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The revolutionary requires that the special coercive force for the suppression of the proletariat by the bourgeoisie, of millions of workers' people by handfuls of the rich, must be replaced by a special coercion force of the suppression of the bourgeoisie by the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The aim was to overthrow the bourgeoisie, to destroy the bourgeois parliamentarism for a democratic republic after the type of the Paris Commune, or a republic of Soviet of workers and soldier deputies for the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. For the proletariat needs state power, a centralized organization of force, and organization of violence, both to crush the resistance of the exploiters and lead to an enormous mass of the population of the peasant, the petty bourgeoisie, and semi-proletariats in the worker organizing a socialist economy. The current state was bourgeois and had to be smashed and replaced by a new kind of state. It is precisely this fundamental point which had been completely ignored by the dominant official social democratic parties and indeed distorted by the former theoretician of the Second International called Kautsky. According to Lenin, the anarchists fail to understand that this new state is indeed just and they fail to understand the organs of suppression. It's the majority of the population, not the minority, which is false in practice. It was always the case under slavery, serfdom, and wage slavery. And since the majority of people itself suppresses or its oppressors, a special force for suppression is no longer necessary in this sense, a state begins to wither away. Therefore, the state cannot be abolished as anarchists claim, but it can and will be disappeared. The practice of Bolshevik regime and later other countries from 1970 and beyond, if they're trying to do the same technique, failed, and the regime did not match the theory, but first we need to discuss the theoretical problems of Lenin's argument in order to understand why this happened, for bad theory produced bad practice. The Paris Commune. The core of Lenin's argument rests on the Paris Commune of 1871 and the lesson of Marx and Engels drew from it. Yet he failed to mention key aspects of this event and, like Marx and Engels, provide a superficial analysis. This is in stark contrast to some anarchists, for example, Kropotkin, who far more on the Commune than Marx or Engels. The key aspect of the Commune for Lenin is summarized by the quote from Marx. One thing especially was proven about the Commune, viz., that the working class cannot simply lay hold on the ready state machinery and lead it for its own purposes. Marx is also quoted on how it was to be working, not a parliamentary body, a secular legislature at the same time. In Lenin's summary, replaced the smashed state machine only by further democracy, abolition understand the army, all officials to be elected subject to recall, and was ceasing to be state since it had to suppress not the majority of the population but a minority, the exploiters. He has smashed the bourgeois state machine. In places of special coercion force the population itself came on the scene. All this was a departure from the state in the proper sense of the word. Yet the Paris Commune was not a new state structure at all, but rather was a transformed municipal council. Indeed, let us quote Marx on how the Commune was formed on a municipal councillors, chosen by universal suffrage in the various wards of the town, responsible and revocable at any time. After the initial spontaneous insurrection on March 18, the Central Committee of Paris National Guard refused to take power itself and instead called elections to its 60 municipal councils with its members elected from its 60 municipal awards by means of male universal suffrage. The Commune then was no Soviet. It was not Soviet, if you heard me correctly. The practical conclusion that Marx and Engels drew from it were as before it, the workers should organize in political parties and take part in political action to capture the state of the national level in the same way as the communards had locally. Lenin confused smashing the state machine with smashing the state itself. It is almost important to note that Marx's Civil War in France is its most appealing work because it's mostly reporting what had happened during the revolution inspired by anarchist ideas. While Marx failed to mention it, the driving force behind the Communist proclamation were internationalists influenced by Proudhon. To see this, we need simply compare Proudhon's position during 1848 revolution to that applied and praised by Marx in 1871, and I quote, "We do not want the government of man by man any more than the exploitation of man by man. It is up to the National Assembly, through organization of its committee, to exercise executive power, just the way it exercises legislative power through its joint deliberations and votes. Socialism is the contrary of governmentalism. Besides, universal suffrage is a consequence of universal suffrage. We want implementation of the imperative mandate imperative. Politicians balk at it, which means that in their eyes, the people in electing representatives not appoint them mandatories but rather abjure their sovereignty. This is certainly not socialism. It's not even democracy." End quote. Lenin, like Marx, forget to mention that the communards called themselves Federalists or Literos. As such, his complaint that the renegade Yurto Bernstein suggested as far as his political content went, Marx's program displayed in all its essential features. The greatest similarity to federalism of Proudhon's ignores the awkward fact that insofar as Marx reports accurately on the revolt, he cannot help but appear to be a federalist. Lenin seemed ignorant of what federalism means. The whole point of federalism is to coordinate activity at the appropriate level, and so cannot be anything other than bottom up. Centralism, in contrast, coordinates everything at the center, and so cannot be anything other than top down. So when Lenin proclaims that when Marx purposely used certain words such as national unity was to be organized to oppose conscious democratic proletariat centralism to bourgeois military bureaucratic centralism, he was completely missing the point. Likewise, Proudhon wrote on how to create national unity from the bottom to the top, from the circumference to the center, and under federalism. The attributes of the central authority become specialized and limited to concerning federal services. So the communards, talking of organizing national unity, had to quote Marx how a few but important functions which will still remain for central government were not to be suppressed as had been deliberate, misstated, but were to be transferred to communal, i.e., strictly responsible officials, is an expression of federalism, not of its denial. That Marx confused the highest federal body with the central government does not change this. Similarly, Proudhon also argued that it was necessary to disarm the powers that be by ending military conscription and organizing a citizen army. It is the right of the citizen to appoint a hierarchy of their military chiefs, the simple soldier and national guards appointing the lower ranks of officers, the officer appointed their superiors. In this way, the army retains its civic feelings, while people organize its military in such a way as to simultaneously guarantee its defense and its liberties. Moreover, he predated Lenin on the replacement of bourgeois democracy by proletariat democracy, by contrasting labor democracy to existing forms. Given this obvious influence, it is not the case that to confuse Marx's view of the destruction of state power, a parasitic excrescence, with Proudhon's federalism is possibly monstrous. For the communards were federalists, and while Lenin proclaimed that there is not a trace of federalism marked above quote observation on the experience of the commune, there had to be in his account were remotely accurate. That before and after the commune Marx was a centralist does not derive from his reporting of the communards, but it does mean we cannot, as Lenin wishes, take the civil war in France as a definitive account of his ideas of social transformation. While for Lenin, Marx had tried to draw practical lessons from and so learn from the commune, in fact, anarchists provide a deeper analysis of the revolt. For Kropotkin, by proclaiming the free commune, the people of Paris proclaimed an essential anarchist principle, but they stopped mid-course and gave themselves a communal council copied from the old municipal council. Thus, the Paris Commune did not break with the traditional state or representative government, and did not attempt to achieve within the commune the organization from the simple to the complex. It inaugurated by proclaiming the independence of the free federation of the communes. The elected revolutionaries were isolated from the masses and shut up in the town hall, which led to disaster as the commune council became immobilized in the midst of paperwork, lost the inspiration that comes from continued contact with the masses, and so themselves paralyzed the popular initiative. This is confirmed by one Marxist account of the commune which admitted in passing that the commune council was overwhelmed by suggestions from other bodies, the sheer volume of which created difficulties, and it found it hard to cope with the stream of people who crammed into the offices. Regardless of Lenin's assertion, the anarchists were right to claim the Paris Commune as a collaboration of their doctrine, and it is the Marxists who had completely misunderstood the lesson. Opportunism. Lenin's work was direct against two main opponents in the Marxist movement, the opportunists and the Kaukistians. The former were the reformist wing of the Social Democratic Party and the most associated with Edward Bernstein. The latter were their main opponent of the Second International and the most associated with Kautsky. Until the outbreak of World War I, Lenin considered himself a follower of Kautsky and repeatedly invoked his right to show his Marxist orthodoxy, most infamously in What is to be Done, where he says socialist consciousness is something introduced into the proletariat class struggle from without by the bourgeois intelligentsia. Even as late as 1913, he praised the fundamentals of parliamentary tactics of German social democracy, which was implacable. The question of principle, it always directed the accomplishment of the final aim. As is well known, Lenin originally disbelieved news reports of German Social Democrat politicians voting for war credits in 1914. Such was his fate in that party. So while he was surprised that it had turned out that in reality the German Social Democratic Party was much more moderate and opportunist than it appeared to be, anarchists were not, for we had predicted and repeatedly denounced the obvious reformists in social democracy for decades. Lenin didn't discuss any opportunism developed in the first place, namely the Marxist tactic of political action by parties in elections rather than the anarchist one of direct action by workers' unions. As such, it was a striking confirmation of Bakunin's warnings that when communist workers aren't sent to legislative assembly, the result is that worker deputies transplant into the bourgeois environment, into the atmosphere of purely bourgeois ideas, will in fact cease to be workers and become statesmen. They will become bourgeois, for men do not make their situation, on the contrary, men are made by them. Indeed, the opportunism is in social democracy from the start, as can be seen from Lenin's admission that Bakunin's attacks were justified, as the People's State was an absurdity and a departure from socialism, and so Engels sought to rid the German social democracy of opportunist prejudice concerning the state in 1875. So while much of Lenin's book is commentary upon the numerous quotes from Marx and Engels and contrasting his interpretation to the then orthodox position, he failed to mention that he, like all Marxists before 1917, were opportunists in the sense that after having read Marx and Engels, they concluded that political action would be used to capture political powers, would then in turn he used to transform both state and society. The reason for this is obvious. Lenin confused smashing the state machine with smashing the state itself. He is right that it was Marx who thought the proletariat cannot simply win state power in the sense that all state apparatus pass into new hands, but must smash this apparatus, must break it, and replace it by a new one. He is wrong in that Marx thought it would be achieved without first securing universal suffrage and then a majority of the legislature. As such, when Lenin states that Kautsky speaks of the winning of state power and no more, and so has chosen a formula which makes a concession of the opportunists, inasmuch as it admits the possibility of seizing power without destroying the state machine. He missed the point. This can be seen in quote from Marx and Engels that Lenin himself provides and to which he feels the need to add commentary to that should be self-evident comments. Thus, after providing a long quote by Engels, Lenin has to add, Engels speak here of the proletarian revolution, abolishing the bourgeois state. While the words about the state withering away refer to the remnants of the proletariat state after the socialist revolution, when Engels himself makes no such distinction and just talks of the state. Similarly, he quotes Engels how if one thing is certain, is that our party and the working class can only come to power in the form of the democratic republic, and that is even the specific form of the dictatorship of the proletarian, as the Great French Revolution has already shown. Before feeling the need to add, presumably hoping his reader will not notice that Engels says no such thing, that Engels relies here in the particular striking from the fundamental idea which runs through all Marxist works, namely that democratic republic is the nearest approach to the dictatorship of the proletarian, thus the specific form becomes the nearest approach. Engels repeatedly suggests that the republic is the ready-made political form for the future role of the proletarian, which in France is already in being. It did so in the next Lenin quotes, so then a unified republic from 1792 to 1798, which French department, each commune, germinant, enjoying a complete self-government of the American model. This is what we too must have. Flow self-government to be organized how we can manage, without bureaucracy as shown to us by America and the First French Republic. It's been shown even today by Australia, Canada, and other English colonies. End quote. There is no mention of the Paris Commune at all in Engels' critique of the draft of the IFO program, which is significant given Lenin's proclaim that it cannot be ignored, for it is with the opportunist view of the Social Democrats on the question of state organization that this criticism is mainly concerned. This position is consistent with Marx's comment on smashing the state machine, which Lenin thinks is so important. This is because it's possible to argue that political action can be used to capture political power, and the first action of the victorious party is to smash the state bureaucracy, as Engels confirmed in 1884 letter when asked to clarify this precise point by Bernstein, and I quote, "It is simply a question of showing that the victorious proletariat must first refashion the old bureaucratic administrative centralized state power before it can use it for its own purposes. While all bourgeois Republicans since 1848 invite against this machinery so long as they were in the opposition, but once they were in the government, they took it over without altering it and used it partly against the reaction, but still more against the proletariat." Which reflects Marx's early comment, a quote by Lenin, on the executive power, which is enormous bureaucratic military organization with its vast and ingenious state machinery, with a host of officials numbering 500,000 besides an army of another 500,000. This appalling parasitic body, all revolution perfected this machine instead of smashing it. So, unlike anarchists who from Proudhon onward had argued there was inevitable chain to capital, and directly against the proletariat, Marxists have viewed the bourgeois state not only able to be captured but to reform in the interest of the working class. The fundamental difference between the opportunists and Kokoskites was that the former simply wished the party to revive the rhetoric used to bring it in line with its reformist practice, while the latter insisted the rhetoric remain revolutionary. However, both utilize the same tactic and aim for the same thing, a social democratic majority. The former wished to use the existing state machine to implement reform to the system and saw no need to smash the state machinery or quickly transform the system. The latter remained true to Marx and argued that to secure the proletariat as the ruling class, Parliament would have to smash the machine in order to replace capitalism with socialism. Given that the Paris Commune had utilized a part of the current state, Parisian Municipal Council to abolish all state machine, it's easy to see why Lenin's interpretation of Marx and Engels took until 1917 to be formulated, particularly given there was no support for electoring and opposition to anarchist calls to smash the state and replace it with a new form of social organization based off federation of workers' groupings. Before turning to this, I must note that Lenin, while finding the time to berate Bernstein for having more than one repeating the vulgar bourgeois jeers at primitive democracy and how he combats the ideas of primitive democracy, binding mandates on paid officials, important central representative bodies, etc., to prove that this is unsound and refer to the experience of the British trade unions as interpreted by the Webs, and that he failed to note how he refers to the same book in what is to be done, in order to prove the absurdity of such a conception of democracy. Anarchism. If Lenin's account of Marxism leaves much to be desired, this is nothing compared to the nonsense he inflicted on anarchism. To describe Lenin's understanding of anarchism as superficial would be generous. He summarized that to consider the difference between Marxists and anarchists, quote, 1. The former, while aiming to complete abolition of the state, required this aim can be only achieved after classes have been abolished by the socialist revolution as a result of the establishment of socialism, which lead to the withering away of the state. The latter want to abolish the state completely overnight, not understanding the conditions under which the state can be abolished. Number 2. The former recognized that after the proletariat has won political power, it must completely destroy the old state machine and replace it by a new one consisting of an organization of armed workers after the type of the commune. The latter, while insisting on the destruction of the state machine, had a very vague idea of what the proletariat would put in its place and how it would use its revolutionary power. The anarchists even denied that the revolutionary proletariat should use the state power, they reject its revolutionary dictatorship. 3. The former demand that the proletariat be trained for revolution by utilizing the present state. The anarchists reject this. End quote. First, regardless of Lenin's suggestions of overnight revolutions, anarchists never viewed such revolution in that way. Quite the opposite, as anarchists always stress that revolutions are difficult and take time, as well they explicitly reject the notion of one-day revolution. Kropotkin argued that while it may be possible to topple and change a government in one day, a revolution, it is so to achieve to tangible outcome, takes 3 to 4 years of revolutionary upheaval, and maybe up to 6 years using the example of the French Revolution and the Paris Commune. then the working class will be in position to finally smash the state and capitalism, its revolt and weakening, and so be free to start constructing a new society. The element of truth in Lenin's statement is that anarchists do reject the Marxist notion that we need a state to rebuild a defense society after a successful revolution. This is because of our different analysis of what the state is. Both agree that all states, current and previous, is an instrument of class rule, that class being the minority of oppressors and exploiters who have monopolized social wealth. Marxists think that the state, whether suitable transformed republic, Konsky and Lenin before 1917, or a new Soviet state, Lenin after 1917, and then Fidel Castro, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, and basically every other Marxist revolution after 1917, kept being an instrument of the majority of the working class for simply a special force of the suppression of a particular class. Anarchists reject this analysis and argue that the state institution is marked by certain structures that allow it to do its task, and the state develops its own interests. The dictatorship of a proletariat will soon become a dictatorship over the proletariat. If you want my more extensive critique of Marxism as a whole, I already made a video called a very long critique of Marxism. This is because the state is an organization of hierarchical centralization. It's a necessarily hierarchical, authoritarian, or it ceases to be a state. It is the absorption of the whole national life and concentration to the pyramid of functionaries. This structure did not appear by accident. What is striking about Lenin's account of the state is that he never ever wondered why this social structure has taken the form it has. The bourgeois state is centralized, and the proletariat state will likewise be, and any attempt to be such as Marx was federalist are dismissed, albeit correctly, for he upheld democratic centralism, the republic one and indivisible. Yet hierarchical and centralized structures are needed for a minority to rule. They exclude the masses from participating in social life, as Proudhon argued, and who benefit from the regime of unity? The people? No, the upper classes. Unity is quite simply a form of bourgeois exploitation under the protection of bayonets. Yes, political unity in the great state is bourgeois. The position which is created, the intrigues which cause, the influence which is cherishes, all is bourgeois and goes to the bourgeois. The centralized hierarchical state is the cornerstone of bourgeois despotism and exploitation. Under the rising bourgeoisie, Kropotkin noted the state was the sole judge, which meant that all the local and insignificant deputies piled up in the form of document in the offices and parliament was literally inundated by thousands of these minor local squabbles. In that look took thousands of functionaries in the capital, most of them corruptible to read, classify, evaluate, and all these to pronounce on the smallest detail, and the flood of issues always rose. The same process would be at the work in the new so-called semi-state. At its true was the centralized and so had a whole new administrative network in order to establish right and enforce obedience. This was why anarchists sought to decentralize decision-making away from one central body into a federation of workplace and community, associated and wondered why Marxists had adopted the idea of the Jacobin state, when this idea had been designed from the viewpoint of the bourgeois, in direct opposition to the egalitarian communist tendency of the people which arose during the French Revolution, especially during the St. Croix, the Erranque, and the Revolution of the Equals. Lenin confused social organization with the state and misses the point by saying we cannot imagine democracy, even proletarian democracy, without representative institution, but we can and must imagine democracy without parliamentarism. For a while, any organization requires delegates to coordinate decision. It is mistaken to confuse this with representative and so centralized government. So, if under socialism, it will govern in turn and will soon become accustomed to no one governing. Under anarchism, rather than having a series of rulers, all will participate in decision making, and the centralistic, bureaucratic, and military organization of the state, which operates from the top down and from center to periphery, will be replaced with a federal organization of association and the communes from the bottom up, from periphery to center, which elected officials answerable to the people with army of the nation. The question is whether these elected bodies are confused on the specific tasks and appropriate levels or whether they, like parliaments, dictate all social matters from the center. In both cases, a representative institution remains in the sense that specific individuals are elected to specific bodies. But Lenin confused the matter by saying the way out of the parliamentarism is not of course the violation of representative institution, and the elected principle, but the conversion of the representative institution from talking shops into workers' bodies. This is only part of what is needed as the question of centralization is key for its greatly decreased popular participation and vastly increased bureaucratic tendencies. For Lenin, the exploiting classes needed political rule to maintain exploitation, i.e., the selfish interests of an insignificant minority against the vast majority of all people. While the exploited classes needed political rule in order to completely abolish all exploitation, anarchists agree with the first part but disagree with the second. Political rule, a state, is needed for a minority class to dominate society and is structured appropriately, hierarchical, centralized, top-down. It is not needed in the defeats the aim when we are talking about formerly exploited classes. The vast majority running society simply because it is not structured to allow that, but create a new centralized social structure. Marxists create the conditions for the birth of a new ruling class, the bureaucracy. This is why anarchists reject the notion of using the state to build socialism. And I quote, the state, with its hierarchy and functionaries and the weight of its historical traditions, could only delay the dawning of the new society free from monopolies and exploitation. What means can the state provide to abolish this monopoly that the working class will not find on its own strength and groups? What advantage could the state provide for abolishing these same class privileges? Could its governmental machine develop from the creation of a hobby of these privileges now being used to abolish them? Will not the new function require new organs? And these new organs would then not have to be created by the workers themselves and their unions, their federations completely outside the state? End quote. Lenin is also keen to confute the need to defend the revolution from the state and quotes from a polemic Marx addressed to the reformists, mutualists, and generalizing it to all anarchists. And I quote, Marx chose the sharpest and clearest way of stating his case against anarchists. After overthrowing the yoke of the capitalists, should the worker take down their arms or use them against the capitalists in order to crush their resistance? But what is systematic use of arms by one class against another in not the transient form of state? End quote. So, according to Marx and Engels, the anarchists urged the working class to rise in insurrection against the bourgeois and its state, and was victorious, then simply put down its arms. It is difficult to take this seriously, particularly as it confused defense of a revolution of freedom with the state. Lenin, like Marx and Engels, joined those who believed that after having brought down government, private property will allow both to be quietly built up again because of the respect for the freedom of those who might feel the need to be rulers and property owners, a truly curious way of interpreting ideas. Lenin suggested the armed worker who proceed to form a militia involving the entire population is a more democratic state machine. Yet if the state was simply this, there will be no disagreement between anarchists and Marxists. And I quote, immediately after establishing government had been overthrown, communes will have to reorganize themselves along revolutionary lines. In order to defend the revolution, the volunteers will at the same time form a communal militia, but no commune can defend itself in isolation. So it will be necessary to radiate revolution outward, to raise all of its neighboring communes in revolt, and to federate them from common defense. End quote. Lenin's innovation was to move away from orthodox Marxist position of the state toward the anarchist position that socialism must be built by workers themselves using the organization. They themselves created the struggle against capitalism. However, he links this to the continued Marxist prejudice in favor of centralized structure, and so his assertion that the new regime is no longer a state proper was simply not true, for in a centralized structure power rests at the top in the hands of the minority with its own class interests. Somewhere Lenin argued that we should fight for a complete destruction of the old state machine in order that the armed proletariat itself may become the government. The anarchists simply note that in a centralized structure it will be the Marxist party leadership who will become the government, not the armed proletariat. And I quote, by popular government, the Marxians mean government of the people by means of small number of representatives elected through universal suffrage, government of the vast majority of the masses of the people by the privileged minority. But this minority, the Marxians argue, will be made up of workers. Yes, to be sure, former workers who, as soon as they become the people's governors and representatives, will stop being workers and will begin to look down upon the proletarian world from the heights of the state. They will then represent not the people, but themselves and their ambitions to ungovern. Anyone who queries that does not know human nature. End quote. In a centralized, one and indivisible republic, electing, mandating, and recording become increasingly meaningless. It will require millions of electors at the base across the country to simultaneously act in the same manner to have any impact. This means there is a substantial space for the interests of the state to diverge from the people. As Bakunin warned, the state cannot be sure of its own self-preservation without armed force to defend it against its own internal enemies, against the discontent of its own people. Which is why, while recognizing the need for insurrection and defense of the revolution, anarchists seek to abolish the state and replace it with the social structure more appropriate for building socialism. For whatever new economic form emerges in the life of a nation, when serfdom, for example, came to replace slavery and later on wage labor for serfdom, a new form of political grouping always had to develop, and so economic emancipation would be accomplished by smashing the old political forms represented by the state. Man will be forced to find new forms of organization for the social function that the state appropriate between its functionaries. Second, the claim that anarchists have only a vague notion of what will replace the state is simply one. Proclaiming that anarchists argue that we must think only of destroying the state machine alone, and it is no use probing into the concrete lessons of proletariat revolutions and analyzing what to put in place of what has been destroyed and how, flies in the face of the many articles and books in which anarchists did precisely that. To quote Bakunin, workers no longer count on anyone but yourself. Abstain from all participation in bourgeois radicalism and organize outside of its force of the proletariat. The basis of the organization is entirely given. The workshop and the federation of the workshop, the creation of funds for resistance, instrumental struggle against the bourgeoisie, and the federation not just nationally, but internationally, the creation of chamber of labor, the liquidation of the state of the bourgeois society, anarchy, that is to say, the open popular revolution, organization from the top to bottom and from the circumstance to the center. The Chamber of Labor were federation of local union grouped by territory, but Bakunin's vision of revolution predicted the Workers' Council of 1905 and 1917. Likewise, Kropotkin argued that independent communes from a territorial grouping and vast federation of trade unions for grouping by social functions, the true interwoven and provide support to each to meet their needs of society, allow the anarchist to conceptualize in a real concrete way the possible organization of a liberated society based on an analysis of both the workers' movement and the Paris Commune, as well as the history of the state. Yet Lenin claimed that anarchists dismissed the question of political forms altogether. Similarly, he was wrong to proclaim that if the workers and peasants organize themselves quite freely in communes and unite the actions of all the communes in striking at capital, in crushing the resistance of the capitalists, and transferring the privately owned railways, factories, land, and so on to the entire nation, to the whole society, then that would be the more consistent democratic centralism. In fact, it would be federalism. And I quote, all productive capital and instruments of labor are to be confiscated for the benefits of toilers' association. The alliance of all labor associations will constitute the commune. There will be a standing federation, the better case of the revolutionary communal councils, made up of delegates, invested with being mandates and accountable of all times. All provinces, communes, and associations will delegate deputies to the agreed place of assembly. All invest in the binding mandate and accountable is subject to recall. In order to found the Federation and Insurgents Association, the communes and provinces. And surprisingly then, it was Kropotkin, not Lenin, who in 1905 saw the Soviets as a means of both fighting and replacing the state, as well as comparing them to the Paris Commune. Thus, the councils of workers were appointed by the workers themselves, just like the insurrectional commune of August 10, 1792. The council completely recalled the Central Committee which preceded the Paris Commune in 1871. It is certain that the workers across the country must organize themselves on this model. These councils represent the revolutionary strength of the working class. Let no one come to proclaim to us the workers of the Latin peoples. By preaching the general strike and direct action, we're going down the wrong path. A new force is thus constituted by the strike, the force of workers asserting themselves the first time and putting in motion the level of any revolution, direct action. The overworkers imitating the rebellious peasants will likely be asked to put their hands on all that is necessary to live and produce. They can lay in the cities an initial foundation of the communist commune. In contrast, the Bolsheviks in 1905 could find nothing better to do than to the present the Soviet with the ultimatum. Immediately adopt a social democratic program or disband. Nor did the Bolsheviks seek to transform or extend the revolution from bourgeois to socialist aim, unlike the anarchists. Given this, perhaps it was the best that the October Revolution by Lenin never wrote the second part of the State Revolution that was to deal with the events of 1905. Of all which makes a mockery of Lenin's assertion that marked anarchists is given nothing even approximately true answer to the concrete political question. Must the old state machine be smashed or should be put in its place? Anarchism and advocate workers' council as a means of both fighting and replacing capitalism and the state since Bakunin clashed with Marx in the International. Third, those paying attention will conclude that the fate of social democracy and its degeneration into opportunism will have shown why anarchists reject taking part in the state by contesting the election. This only trains workers in letting others act for them, and so disaccustomed to the people to the direct care of their own interests as schools, the one in slavishness and others in intrigue and lies. As Kropotkin stressed, and I quote, we see in the incapacity of the statist socialists to understand the true historic problem of socialism, a gross error of judgment, to tell the workers that they will be to introduce the socialist system while retaining the machine of the state and only changing the man in power, prevent instead of aiding the mind of the worker progressing towards the search for new forms of life that will be their own. That is in our eyes a historic mistake which borders on the criminal. Instead of electoring, anarchists since the beginning of the International to the present have taken the active part of the workers' organization formed for the direct struggle of labor against capital. This struggle, while certainly far more powerful than any indirect action to secure some improvement of the life of the worker and opening out to the eyes of the worker the evil done to society by capitalist organization and by the state that upholds it. This struggle also awakened the workers' thoughts concerning the form of consumption, production, and direct exchange between those concerned without the intervention of the capitalist and the state. Finally, Lenin's work is the source of the common assertion by Marxists that most anarchists support the ruling class during the First World War, regardless of his comment about the few anarchists who preserve a sense of honor and conscience. By opposing the war, indeed a pro-war anarchist is found having amongst them comrades who we love and respect most, who are not numerous, and almost all of the anarchists have remained faithful to their conviction. Nor does Lenin mention that these few, which sadly include Kropotkin, had rejected Bakunin's position in turn the imperialist war into revolution in favor of Engels' defense of the fatherland, while ironically Lenin went the opposite way. Socialism. State and Revolution is primarily a study of political structure and the ideological defense for Lenin's new position. There is very little in its socialism, or more correctly, the initial step of socialist state would take once power had been seized, but those whose words are significant. The key factor for Lenin is not who manages production, but rather who owns property. The means of production are no longer the private property of individuals, but they will belong to the whole of society, and while there will initially be differences in wealth, the exploitation man by man will have become impossible because it will be impossible to seize the means of production, the factories, machines, lands, etc., and make them private property. Yes, it is perfectly possible for the exploitation to exist without private property. It depends how society owns the means of production. Do workers manage their own labor and does not somewhere else the state do that? Lenin's vision of socialism set up the later possibility of equating socialism with universal wage labor rather than its abolition. And I quote, all citizens are transformed into higher employees of the state. All citizens become employees and workers of a single countrywide state syndicate. The whole of society who have become a single office, a single factory with the equality of labor and pay, end quote. There is some talk of how we must start with the expropriation of the capitalists, with the establishment of workers' control over the capitalists. But why workers would need to control capitalists who have had their property expropriated is not immediately obvious. A closer read shows that Lenin had no desire to immediately expropriate the capitalists and introduce workers' management of production, which we can see today's China, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, and Laos, and all the previous Marxist states that existed before. Instead, the capitalists will remain and control must be exercised not by a state of bureaucrats, but by a state of armed workers. While the political structure created by capitalism had to be smashed, the economic ones that had to be used as an economic foundation for socialism, according, these people. A witty German social democrat called the Postal Service and assembled a socialist economic system. This is very true, as the President of the Postal Service is a business organized on the lines of state capitalist monopoly. Imperialism is gradually transforming all trust into an organization of a similar type, in which one has the same bourgeois bureaucracy, but the mechanism of social management is here already to hand. Once we have overthrown the capitalists and smashed the bureaucratic machinery of the mother state, we will all have splendidly equipped mechanism, free from the parasite of mechanism that can be very well be set going by the United Workers themselves, who will be hired technicians, foremen, and accountants, and pay them all as needed all state officials in general workman's wages. He is concrete, practical tasks which can immediately be fulfilled in relation to all trusts and tasks whose fulfillment will rid the working people of exploitation. The Bolshevik immediate aim was to organize the whole economy on the lines of the postal service, on the base of what capitalism has already created. So the structure created by the capitalists and their state, feeding for their priorities and interests, will be extended with the conversation of all citizens, the workers, and other employees on one huge syndicate, the whole state, the complete subordination of the entire work of this syndicate to a genuinely democratic state, the state of the Soviets of the workers and soldier deputies. Control, then, will be by the state initially over the capitalists by eventually of state employees. Lenin is well aware of Engels' infamous article on authority, which he ridiculed the model ideas of Proudhonists, who called themselves anti-authoritarian, i.e. repugnant all authority, all subordination, all power. Take a factory, a railway, a ship on the high sea, said Engels. It's not clear that not one of these complex conditions established based on the use of machinery and the systematic cooperation of many people could function without a certain amount of subordination and consequently without a certain amount of authority or power. Yet Engels argued much more strongly than that, and I quote, organization means that questions are settled in an authoritarian way. The automatic machinery of the big factory is much more despotic than the small capitalist who employ workers ever have been. If man, by dint of his knowledge and inventive genius, has subdued the force of nature, the latter avenge themselves upon him by subjecting him, insofar as he employs them to a veritable despotism, independent of all social organization. End quote. Lenin's aim was to turn the new economy into a single factory under the control of the state, yet did not conclude that this would be a more despotic than capitalism. He completely failed to realize that without workers' management and production, when equality is achieved for all members of society in relation to ownership of the means of production, that is, equality of labor and wages, is just turning them into wage slaves of the state bureaucracy. Capitalism, individual ownership by the few, turns into state capitalism. Collective ownership by the few in the new centralized structure of the state, the institution inherent from capitalism. This is nothing in Lenin's work that suggests anything like Proudhon's vision of socialism, built by workers themselves using their own organization, and I quote, on the Universal Association, ownership of the land and the instrument of labor is social ownership. We do not want the exploitation by the state. It is still monarchical, still wage labor. We want democratically organized workers' association. The pioneer core of the vast federation of companies and societies woven into the common club of the democratic social republic. Similar, there is no mention that strongly centralized government could command that a prescribed quantity of goods be sent to such a place on such a day, and by received in a given day by specified officials and stored in particular warehouses, was not only undesirable but also widely utopian, not least because it could not utilize the cooperation, the utilitarianism of the local knowledge of the people. Hence the anarchist prediction that to hand over the state all the main sources of economic life and also the management of all the main branches of the industry, it will create a new instrument of tyranny. State capitalism will only increase the power of bureaucracy and capitalism. This new bureaucracy will end by making expropriation hateful in the eyes of all. The party. The most obvious difference the furious day revolution and the practice of the new regime is that of the book makes next to no mention of the vanguard party and its role. The most significant mention is ambiguous, and I quote, by education the Workers' Party, Marxism educate the vanguard and the proletariat, capital assuming power and leading the whole people to socialism, of directing and organizing the new system of being the teacher and the guide, the leader of all the working and exploited people and organizing their social life without the bourgeois and against the bourgeoisie. End quote. It is the proletarian or its vanguard that assumed power. Lenin's authority during 1917 made it clear that it is the vanguard, the party which assumed power. Given this, we need to understand the nature of the party Lenin spent his life building, whose ideology will necessarily shape the decision being made and structure being built. The first to note about the vanguard is how important it is for socialism. Without the right kind of party, socialism will be impossible. As Lenin stressed in 1902, there could not have been social democratic consciousness among the workers, as it must be brought them from without. The history of all countries, from that the working class, exclusively by its own effort, is able to develop only trade union consciousness, while the theory of socialism, however, grew out of philosophic, historical, economic theories elaborated by educated representatives of the property classes by intellectuals. The party was needed to educate a class that could never develop socialist ideas by themselves, and I quote, there can be no talk of an independent ideology formulated by the working masses themselves in the process of their movement. The only choice is either bourgeois or socialist ideology. There is no middle course. Hence, the belittle of the socialist ideology in any way to turn aside from it in the slightest degree means of straining bourgeois ideology. There is much talk of spontaneity, but the spontaneous development of the working class will lead to the subordination to bourgeois ideology. Hence, our task, the task of the social democracy, is to combat spontaneity, to divert the working class movement from this spontaneous trade unionist striving to come under the wing of the bourgeoisie and to bring it under the wing of the revolutionary social democracy. End quote. Ignoring the obvious point that history shows no such thing as an obvious counterexample, in 1917 the masses were incomparably more revolutionary than the party, which in turn was more revolutionary than its Comintern. This perspective cannot help to give the party, more particularly its leadership, a privileged position. The obvious conclusion is that to disagree with the party and its leadership was to show the absence of socialist consciousness. The party then substituted itself for the working class. The perspective helped explain one of Lenin's stranger comments in the State Revolution. I quote, we are not utopians. We do not dream of dispensing once with all administrative with all subordination. These anarchist dreams, based upon the incomprehension of the attacks of the proletariat dictatorship, are totally alien to Marxism. As a matter of fact, so it's only to postpone the socialist revolution until people are different. No, we want a socialist revolution with people as they are now, with people who cannot dispense with subordination, control for men and accountants. End quote. Ignoring the awkward fact that administration no more equates to subordination than organization equates to authority, and so these anarchist dreams exist only in Lenin's head. This statement flows naturally from the perspective that the working class cannot, by their own struggle, change themselves. At best, the majority can recognize that the party embodies its interests and vote for it, even join it if the party considers them suitable. Some will object since Lenin does add the subordination, however, must be to arm the vanguard of all the exploited and working people, i.e. the proletariat. But this is a question begging for surely the proletariat are people too? How can the class also dispense at once with all administration, with all the subordination? But then Lenin talks about establishing strict iron discipline backed by the state power of the armed workers. This is significant as during the 1905 revolution, he mocked the Mensheviks for only wanting pressure from the below, which was pressure by the citizens of the revolutionary government. Instead, Lenin argued for pressure from above as well from below, where pressure from above was pressure by the revolutionary government of the citizen. He notes that Engels appreciated the importance of action from above, and that he saw the need for the utilization of the revolutionary governmental power. For limitation in principle of revolutionary action to pressure from below, and renunciation of pressure also from above is anarchism. The 1905 revolution also saw this deep-rooted suspicion of working-class self-activity surface in St. Petersburg Bolshevik. They were conceived that only a strong party along class lines can guide the proletariat political movement and preserve the integrity of its program. Rather, a political mixture of this kind, and determine and facilitating political organizations such as the workers' councils, represent and cannot help but represent. So the Soviet could not reflect workers' interests, and because they were elected by the workers. Lenin, for this credit, fought against this position when he turned from the exile, but support for the Soviet was that he put in 1907 for the purpose of developing and strengthening the Social Democratic Labor Party. And if social democratic activities among the proletariat masses are properly effective and widely organized, such institutions may actually become superfluous. Building the party remains the end and working class self-organization merely a means. As well as privileging the party over the class, the leadership is privileged over the membership. The leadership naturally substitutes itself with the memberships required by the state by transformation of the power of ideas into the power of authority and the subordination of lower party bodies to higher ones. A centralized top-down perspective becomes unnecessary. And I quote, if the organizational principle of revolutionary social democracy is opposed to the organizational principle of opportunist social democracy, the latter strive to proceed from the bottom upward, the former strive to proceed from the top downward. End quote. The need for centralization from the assumption of vanguardism. If socialist consciousness comes from outside the working class, then it also applies within the party. Has the need for central control beyond the notion that is more efficient and effective than federalism. So the vanguard party is centralized like the capitalist system it will claim to oppose. The anarchist has long argued that the centralization of the state structure produced a rather bureaucracy, and unsurprisingly, the Bolshevik Party likewise produced a cast of officials. Discussing the Bolshevik in 1905, Trotsky pointed out this tendency existed from the start, and I quote, the habits are peculiar to the political machine were already formed in the underground. The young revolutionary bureaucrats were already emerged as a type. The condition of conspiracy, true enough, offered a very meager scope of such formality of democracy as electivist, accountability, and control. Yet, undoubtedly, the commitment here narrowed these limitations, considered more than any necessary demand, and were far more interested in serve with the revolutionary workers' men and then with the cells, prefer to domineer even on occasion to call the lending of attentive ear to the voice of the masses. End quote. Unsurprisingly, Lenin also spent a lot of energy fighting the bureaucracy of his own party in 1917 to push the revolution forward. As Trotsky reported, as often happens, a sharp cleavage developed between the classes in motion and its interests of the party machines. Even the Bolshevik party's cadets, who enjoyed the benefit of exceptional revolutionary training, were definitely inclined to disregard the masses and to identify their own special interests and the interests of the machine on the very day after the monarchy was overthrown. What then could be expected of these cadets when they become all-powerful state bureaucracy? And it is now that to question the reality of the Bolshevik regime that we turn. I will put videos in the description about what they put in practice, both the article itself and there's a special video called State and Counter Revolution, which is a great video analyzing in practice a little more entertaining detail. Alternatives. It may be objected that we are indulged in armchair theorizing and the fact that it was the Bolsheviks and not the anarchists who were facing civil war and imperialist intervention show that anarchists should, as Trotsky complained, be consigned into the dustbin of history, except for two facts. First, the Bolshevik descent into authoritarianism preceded the Civil War, and second, anarchists did face those challenges and did not succumb as the Bolsheviks did. Look at the Ukrainian Free Territory and the Conscript Rebellion. We show the former space preclude a detailed account of the latter beyond indicated the Menshevik movement in Ukraine faced the same, arguably worse pressures and encouraged social democracy, freedom of speech, workers' management, and so on, while the Bolsheviks repressed them. After helping the defeat of the whites, the Bolsheviks betrayed the Makovins and crushed them after yet more months of fighting. This counterexample, flawed as any real movement could be compared to the ideal, undoubtedly showed that the ideas and structure matter, thus prejudice in favor of centralization, notions that top-down structure reflect revolutionary social democracy, impoverished vision of socialism, the previous position of the party, the confusion of defending freedom with authoritarian methods, all played their part in the failure of the Russian Revolution and the degeneration of the Bolshevik regime. Regardless of Lenin's claim, anarchists do not envision overnight revolutions. Emma Goldman, for example, did not come to Russia expecting to find anarchists and realize, nor did she expect anarchists to follow the immediate footsteps of centuries of despotism and submission, whereas she hoped to find Russia at least the beginnings of social change for which the revolution had been fought, and the Russian workers and the peasants as a whole had derived essential social betterment as a result of the Bolshevik regime, but hopes were dashed. So anarchists did not and do not contract the reality of Bolshevik Russia with the impossible ideal of the sweetly created utopia. Rather, the issue whether the masses will rebuild a better world, they were subject to a new minority regime. Regardless of Lenin's claims in 1917, the latter was a case of the new Soviet system with its ruling party, marginalized Soviet centralization, bureaucracy appointed from above dictatorial managers, nationalization, and so forth. The Bolsheviks may have won the Civil War, but they lost the revolution. The continued mass worker class protests from the spring of 1918 onward, this is during and after the Civil War, indicate there was a social base upon which an alternative could be built. This will involve, as anarchists argue at the time, keeping the Soviets delicate from workplace and actually eliminate second body, supporting the factory communities and their federations, supporting customers cooperatives, keeping democratic armed forces, protecting freedom of press, assembly and organization, implementing socialization rather than nationalization. In short, recognizing that freedom is not optional extra during the revolution but is only guaranteed, by recognizing the validity of anarchism, for it did not correctly predicted the failure of Marxism by accident. Finally, while the Russian Revolution showed the bankruptcy of the vanguardism, it also showed the pressing need for anarchists to organize as anarchists to influence the class struggle. The Russian anarchists, unlike the Ukrainian comrades, did not organize sufficiently and pay the price. Rising anarchist influence in 1970 could not make up for the previous lack of systematic organization and activity within the labor movement. Only anarchists having a firm social basis who have met the victory for the honor revolution against both red and white authority. Conclusion. If, as Lenin argued, the state is a power which rose from society, who places itself above and alienates itself from more from it, consists of special body of armed men having prison, etc., had the command that the Bolshevik regime was most definitely a state in the normal sense of the term. The notion that the semi-state or some such cannot be sustained, for from the moment of Bolshevik seizing power, the Soviets were marginalized from decision-making and transformed into the working bodies into taking shop, while all around them a new bureaucracy grew and the staggering rate of the regime created regular armed forces, specialized armed political police force with its own prison, etc. The key difference is that rather than being an instrument of the bourgeois of feudal aristocracy, as had the Tsarist state it replaced, it was the instrument of a new minority, the party leadership of the state bureaucracy. This ruling class combined political and economic power in its own hands, the larger slowly but surely replacing the former as the real power within the social hierarchy. While many anarchists concentrate on the conscript rebellion of early 1921, presumably because noted anarchists like Emma Goldman and Parkman arrived in Russia in 1920, the fate of the revolution was made much earlier. The Honor Revolution had been fighting for its life from the start, as the anti-socialist tendency of the regime expressed themselves rapidly within 6 months of the October Revolution. The so-called semi-state and the features of the state in the proper sense of the word, as well as to one-party dictatorship and state capitalism by early 1990, in reality of and necessary for party dictatorship become official ideology. Sinofif proclaimed it at the Second Congress of the Communist International, while Trotsky was still arguing for the objective necessity of the dictatorship of the party into the late 1930s. The so-called worker state was needed to repress the workers, and I quote, the very same masses are at different times inspired by different moods and objectives. It is just for this reason that a centralized organization of the vanguard is indispensable. Only a party winning the authority that it has won is capable of overcoming the facilitation of the masses themselves. If the dictatorship of the proletariat means anything at all, then it means that a vanguard of the proletariat is armed with the resources of the state in order to repel danger, including those emanating from the backyard layers of the proletariat themselves. As everyone is, by definition, backward compared to the vanguard, and facilitation get expressed by elections, mandates, recall, and we have the logical conclusion of vanguard, so Lenin what is to be done. In Trotsky's implicit acknowledgement that the party needs a state in the prosperous sense of the word, the working class is now a ruling class in the new state. The reality of the revolution did not reflect the promise made in 1917. Yet looking closely in the promises, the Lenin state and revolution, we can see the role ideology playing in the degeneration. Ideas matter particularly. The ideas, those at the highest level of the state. Structures matter if they are not neutral but reflect class interests and needs they shape a decision made by those in power and by either fostering or hindering meaningful mass participation in society. Both ideas and structure advocated by Lenin in 1917 had their negative impact. That the Bolsheviks initially elected did not undermine the dynamic inherent the centralized political and economic structure they favored and built. A bloated bureaucratic state and a state capitalist economy were inevitable. The combination of Bolshevik ideology and its favored centralized top-down structure produced the outcome and confirmed anarchist theory. Lenin was right when he said, so long as the state exists, there is no freedom. Where there is freedom, there will be no state. His error was thinking that a state, a centralized hierarchical structure developed by a few to secure their rule, could be utilized in a different way. Even when based on workers' organization, he clearly reverted to his role of securing minority rule. In the case that a party leadership and the bureaucracy with any centralized structure generates, Anarchist warnings were proven right, and only anarchism offered a solution in the form of a federalist, self-managed, bottom-up social organization. The social Russian Revolution showed that it was not a case of the state and revolution, but rather the state or revolution.